angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology, conspiracy, discovery, special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of SkyWatch TV.
The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took wives of all they chose. What does that mean? Where did that originate? Welcome to SkyWatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me in studio this week, the host of Into the Multiverse, one of the many web-only or web exclusives from SkyWatch TV. You'll find it at skywatchtv.com. Josh Peck.
Hey, Derek.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And the scholar in residence from Logos Bible Software and the author of a number of books we recommend for your reference library, most specifically The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible, Dr. Michael Heiser. Mike,
right.
welcome back to SkyWatch TV.
Yeah. Thanks.
Genesis 6, 1 through 4, of course, that's the passage that describes the angels who kept not their first estate,
Sure.
as referenced in the New Testament, who came down and mated with human women, produced the giants, the Nephilim. Did that story originate with Moses or with the Torah, the Pentateuch, or was there an earlier version of that story? What was the source material?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked the question that way, because there's actually two different ways of looking at it. One is, again, that the writer of Genesis is sort of borrowing something. And the other is that the writer of Genesis is aware of something, a storyline, a plot line, a backstory, and is using that for some specific purpose. And what you really get in the case of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is a little bit of both. Now, we're not saying that the biblical writers depended on this, like, oh, hey, we have 4 verses to fill in here, like what should we do? I can't think of anything, and pull something off the shelf, and I got it, let's just change this one up. That isn't what's going on. In Scripture, a lot of what you have, especially in the Old Testament, that bears some similarity to some other ancient text, is done for deliberate theological purposes. The biblical writers are going to take an idea or a statement or a story out and say, well, you may be familiar with this, but that isn't really the whole story, or that's really not the true story, or we don't want you to buy into this. We're going to correct it in some way. And that's actually what you get with Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And we can talk about some of the specifics to that if you like.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm interested in, is how the actual Mesopotamian version of this counteracts with the biblical one, and why that's so important to help us interpret the biblical version.
I think we should start off right away by saying, and this might startle some of your listeners, but it's true. And that is, a lot of the material that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes here, you will not find in commentaries. A lot of the research for this, again, scholars have been looking at flood stories from Mesopotamia for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so they're aware of the figures that are actually, the Mesopotamian figures that are behind the backstory, the Apkallu, and I'll talk about who they were. But nobody until 2010, believe it or not, ever did a systematic study of the Apkallu, very specifically for, okay, why are they here? What's going on? And what about this story are the biblical writers, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, what are they shooting at here? Mm-hmm. So that was in 2010 that was done. So if your commentaries on your shelf at home are predating that and don't interact with this recent work, they are by definition obsolete from the get-go. So what the Mesopotamian backstory is that, for those listeners who might be familiar with the general flood story, the gods are upset, the people are noisy down there, we need to get rid of them because, they're a headache and all this sort of thing. Well, part of the primeval story for a Mesopotamian, if you grew up in Mesopotamia, you would have been taught about the Apkallu. The Apkallu, before the flood, he thought, are divine beings. And they're the ones who dispense great knowledge to humanity. They're the ones who are responsible for civilization. They are these civilization heroes for Mesopotamia. Well, they're not the ones who want to get rid of people. Those are the higher ups. And so the Apkallu sort of have a problem. Well, we've invested a lot of time here in humanity, and we, they're like friendly. We kind of like humans. And so if the gods want to wipe them out with a flood, what's going to happen, to all of this that we've taught them? How is civilization going to go on? How's humanity going to survive? Mm-hmm. And with it, this great knowledge that we've given them. And so there's this story about the Apkallu that they come up with, an opportunity to try to undo the effects of the great flood that the gods, are going to send on humanity and do. And what they do is, apparently, they cohabit with human women. And we say that's the answer because before the flood, the Apkallu are referred to as divine beings. After the flood, they are not. They're referred to as, for lack of a better term, hybrid beings. Those who, are from human women. You'll actually see this phrase in cuneiform tablets, that the Apkallu now that are, have this lineage, have a human lineage to them. They're the ones who survived the flood, again, to, keep civilization alive and so on and so forth. Well, to people, it's like that's heroic. That's a wonderful thing to do. But Marduk, the great god at Babylon, is really angry. And he says the Apkallu are going to be sent back to the abyss from which they came, never to return again. So now look at what you have here. You have divine beings before the flood. They mix, their themselves, with humanity in the course of the events of the flood to try to, keep this agenda alive. After the flood, you have them referred to as hybrids. And by the way, Apkallu after the flood are also described in another way. They're also giants. Gilgamesh is called Lord of the Apkallu, and Gilgamesh is described as, giant. He has gigantic proportions. So you have every element of Genesis 6:1 through 4 in the Mesopotamian backstory.
Wow.
And so what's going on, and scholars have wondered a long time why, these 4 verses are so bizarre. What role do they play? They just look like, I've come across scholars that refer to them as just refer to these verses as a polytheistic appendage that's just garbage, they don't know what to do with it. Because it's so different than anything else. Well, what they're there for is to telegraph, look, you may have heard, or you're going to hear Babylonians and other people say, well, this is why we're great. This is why we're better. This is why the gods have blessed us, the greatest civilization on the earth and all this kind of talk. And it's because we inherited this great wisdom. And we inherited it because these gods stepped out and risked themselves for us. And, they're heroes, and this is great. And the biblical writers are like, not really. Yeah, you may have heard that, but here's the correct story. Because this is a transgression. This is something that never should have happened. You shouldn't have heaven and earth doing this. And the product of that, the Nephilim, are going to be picked up later in the conquest narrative as being the progenitors of the Anakim, who, oh, by the way, were the ones who were bent on the annihilation of us, the Israelites. So this was not a good thing. This is not, this heaven and earth mixture was never intended to be something that the true God willed and wanted to happen. And so it picks up on that story to sort of correct it and orient Israelites to how we should really be thinking about the events of the flood.
This is fascinating because Gilgamesh is generally considered by historians to be an historical king. In fact, just prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a team working in the Euphrates thought that they had found the actual tomb of Gilgamesh. So I read the article that you referenced by Amar Anus. But I had somehow missed the part about it shows you something about my reading comprehension. So the Apkallu were well known to the ancient Near East, the Mesopotamians, and generally speaking, they considered them to be beneficial, or were they
were considered? They were considered beneficial, although you will find negative statements about them as well. Now, the scribal class sort of made them heroes because the Apkallu were the dispensers of divine knowledge, and if you were a scribe,
well, that made you special.
It made you special because you're mastering the content. So you're chosen, to be the inheritor of this great knowledge. But there are other statements about them that connect the Apkallu with, witchcraft, with demonization. in Mesopotamia. This is not just biblical stuff or biblical writers making up stories about the Apkallu. This is Mesopotamian material.
So even the Mesopotamians recognized that.
Right, that maybe these guys aren't all good guys. Maybe there's something going on here now.
Yeah, if you were a farmer who had daughters, it might be a different kettle of fish than if you were one of the chosen scribes.
That makes sense.
In the Greco-Roman world, you have a term like daimon, which is actually neutral. It's just a divine being, could be good or evil, like a spirit. And Apkallu in Mesopotamia kind of feels that way in a lot of places, because it can be either a white hat or a black hat. But if you're a scribe, it's like, oh, these guys are great, because we're the beneficiaries. We've inherited this knowledge, and now we instruct the kings like they instructed kings. The scribes use them to sort of elevate their own status. But for the general person, it's like, well, it's not that rosy of a picture. There's something else going on here. So even, you get hints of that. The Gilgamesh thing is really interesting for another reason too. Gilgamesh is mentioned by name in the Book of the Giants in the intertestamental period.
Really?
Yeah, he is. So we've talked before about how Jews, again, coming out of Babylon, they go back to their homeland, and then for a couple hundred years you have this intertestamental period where Jewish thinkers and writers are writing about their Old Testament, writing religious content, theological stuff. And they have preserved a number of traditions that you get from the Apkallu story, that the Apkallu were sent into the underworld, they were punished. That's where you get the angels, who were put in chains in gloomy darkness. You don't get that in Genesis 6, but when Peter talks about the angels that sinned at the time of the flood, then he throws that in, it tells you that Peter's familiar with this whole set of ideas, this whole matrix of ideas. And part of that mix is something called the Book of the Giants. And it's scholars refer to it as Enochian material because it sounds a lot like First Enoch, the whole Watcher story, the giant story there. Again, part of a kind of a genre complex of ideas. But Gilgamesh is actually in there, along with there's 2 or 3 other giants named. And it links, it's just another good evidence that Jews living in this time period understood the original context for Genesis 6:1 through 4. And the reason we don't, I think, is because we never look at that stuff in between the Testaments. We never look and ask the question, okay, what was going on in Mesopotamia that might be a touch point here? And I think even worse than all that's like negligence there. But even worse, we, in our tradition, in modern Christianity, we willfully try to strip the supernatural out of the passage. And it disincentivizes going to look for, well, what were they actually thinking back then? Why would Peter look at this passage and refer to the angels that sinned? Because there isn't any other candidate for that, in terms of the Old Testament. Why is he thinking that way? Instead of asking what I think are obvious questions, it's like, oh, well, there's nothing to see here. They're just people, and here's the explanation that will make this go away, that will let you put it on the shelf.
Wow. What does it actually say about Gilgamesh in the Book of the Giants? Does it have a lot of information?
It doesn't have a lot. It refers to him again as someone who is a post-flood hero. It telegraphs again his role as not sort of a culture warrior or a culture hero, but a little bit of that, because he does inherit the Apkallu knowledge, and so he gets cast in that role a little bit, but there isn't a lot of detail. It just mentions him specifically in connection with the flood as well, this is just a guy. This is like a real person, but again, real but yet kind of different too, for this reason.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, if the Hebrew writers were drawing upon Mesopotamian material, of course, skeptics are going to say that they were cribbing their entire religion from the ancient Mesopotamians. How do we know that's not true? And better yet, we'll tease you with this. Why was the bed of Og of Bashan 9 cubits long? That and more as SkyWatch TV continues after this. Finally, a book that helps you make sense of the hard-to-understand parts of the Bible. SkyWatch TV is proud to offer The Unseen Realm by ancient language and Bible scholar Dr. Michael S. Heiser. He takes you into the world of the men who wrote the Bible under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and by understanding their worldview, you will better understand some of the weird parts of the Bible. Like, why was it so important to mention giants in the Old Testament? And why did Peter and Jude reference the angels who created them in the New Testament? The supernatural war between God and the fallen angels is real. The unseen realm helps you understand the way the apostles and prophets saw that war. And when you order The Unseen Realm from SkyWatch TV, we will add these 2 books free: The Supernatural Worldview by Chris Putnam and G.H. Pember's classic Earth's Earliest Ages. Order The Unseen Realm now by calling the number on your screen or log on to skywatchtvstore.com. Welcome back to SkyWatch TV. Please remember to log on to skywatchtv.com for web-exclusive content. There are interviews we just can't fit into our network television schedule. And, of course, programs like Into the Multiverse with Josh Peck and his wife, Christina, examining the very fabric of reality down to the particle level, light.
And beyond.
And beyond. Sci Friday, a look at science every week with our science editor, my best friend and wife, Sharon Gilbert. And, of course, daily news updates as well. All of that linked at skywatchtv.com. Mike, the skeptics will often say that because there are such similarities between the Bible and the stories from ancient Mesopotamia, that the Hebrews must have copied their religion from the Mesopotamians, that Yahweh was just a creation copied from earlier gods like Marduk or Enlil. Or how do we know that that's not the case?
Yeah, it's actually a good example of category confusion, because on the one hand, and I like the way you actually put it, borrowing their religion or getting their theology from Mesopotamia. It's kind of hard to make that argument when you're attacking Mesopotamian texts and you're going after Mesopotamian gods and you're going after Mesopotamian religious, theology, that you're an opponent of it. You're casting yourself as against it. Now, to do that, I don't know how you'd oppose something without interacting with it or quoting it correctly. Okay, again, we do these sorts of things. If I could write an essay interacting with atheism. Okay, I'm not getting my theology from atheism. I'm quoting an atheist. I'm using that material to make a point that an atheist would make, but then I'm going to respond to it, or I'm going to tweak
Josh gets
something.
called a New Ager when he starts attacking quantum physics and the way New Agers use quantum physics, and because he's doing that, then he's represented as advancing this idea.
It's a category confusion. But you can't interact with something negatively if you never quote it. I mean, how would you do that? How would anybody know that's what you're doing? So, I mean, right away you have the category confusion problem. The whole idea kind of presupposes too that, the ancient world had FedEx or had libraries or had the internet. I mean, the average Israelite, the average prophet, is not going to have access to these texts. Now, they're going to have heard the stories, passed on orally by people they meet. They interact with people about spiritual things like the way we do now, and you learn what they believe and you tell them what you believe. There's all this cross-fertilization that goes on just in the course of normal life. And in their case, they live geographically close to each other. So it's inevitable that you're going to find out who believes this or that about this or that deity. And your neighbor is going to think, well, who makes the crops grow? Well, we don't do that. And again, they're not doing meteorology. So it's, well, there must be a God in charge of that.
Right.
And so, your neighbor over in Egypt will say, well, that's this one. Or Mesopotamia, no, it's this deity. And the Israelites are going to say, well, it's Yahweh of Israel. He's our God. He's the true God. In fact, he's the one that, sort of is in command of all you other guys. And he's the one that's going to give you what you deserve in the end. So you have just a geographical proximity and just the normal interaction of life and competing ideas. You don't have to have I can't think a religious thought here without a text. Quick, someone mail me something from Mesopotamia so I can have a thought.
Well, we kind of do that nowadays too, don't we? And we see that a lot in the Christian church. If somebody doesn't know something, sometimes they'll just kind of go with what they might think or what feels right, not always looking directly at the text that we have available. So imagine if we didn't even have that text available, what we would think.
Yeah, and sometimes I get in trouble for this. Look, folks, newsflash, the biblical writers were people. They really were. They were human beings. They had normal interaction with other human beings. Why the critics, again, just come across, frankly, as just silly. Because, again, it presupposes this Israel of all people in the ancient world. Every Israelite was too stupid to have a theological thought without looking at somebody else's work. Everybody's cheating off somebody else's desk. except for Egypt, except for everybody else, but the Israelites.
Except for everybody else, right.
You know, it's just ridiculous to make these assumptions about, you know, people just going through their day thinking about, hey, how does the world work? Why are we here? We all do this.
Right.
They're no different than anybody else.
We never see anybody speculate that perhaps there was an original source for this material that got confused and dispersed into other languages after Babel, of course, that these are just simply different accounts from different worldviews of the same basic events. That the reason there are flood accounts in different cultures is because they all remember the same event, but it's never remembered the same way. And of course, those other nations were under the influence of other spiritual guides, to use kind of an imprecise term, these other false small g gods who set themselves up.
Yeah, I think really those are all file drawers, you know, that are useful and probably in operation. It's probably not just one, you know, sort of thing for why people are thinking what they're thinking. I think they're all in play because, you know, we can all come up with analogies today, you know, where they're all, you know, sort of in play. I think there would be collective memory of something like a flood event, especially in you know, the geographical ancient Near East. You know, so even if you take a local or a regional view, well, that's a collective memory. That was a traumatic event, and people are going to pass that on, and eventually it's going to get codified in writing, and then different civilizations are going to sort of compete for credit or want to assign blame, you know, to somebody else. You know, so you're going to have to kind of parse it the way, you know, again, a person living in antiquity, because they're predisposed to see that, you know, the spiritual world is interactive with their world. They're not like us. You know, even Christians, that I often accuse Christians of being selectively supernatural. You know, where we want to believe in a Trinity and the virgin birth, but we don't want to believe anything about Genesis 6 or some of this other stuff. That isn't the way that the ancient person is going to be doing that. They're going to be looking for, you know, spiritual powers, spiritual causes and effects to what's going on. So I think that, again, would be certainly a part of what, you know, why they're thinking what they're thinking.
Makes a lot of sense.
When the Hebrew prophets were writing these stories down, and when Moses, for example, wrote the account of their victory over Og of Bashan, I want to get this because I think this is such a cool point. And I think it illustrates...
I know where you're going here.
Yeah, and I think it illustrates what you're writing about in the unseen realm and why it's important to understand the backstory, to understand what Moses and the other Hebrew prophets were trying to convey in their writings. The detail of Og's bed, we normally hear the story that, you know, Og, because he was of the Rephaim, must have been really tall because his bed was 9 cubits long. Behold, it is still in, you know, Ramah of the Ammonites. Why did Moses include that detail?
Because he knew there would be Bible trivia games that would be involved.
But he'll be here all week.
No,
thank you.
But we look at stuff like this, and that's kind of what we assign it to. Like, it's just this throwaway detail, but it's actually not. You know, in this case, yeah, I mean, Og is definitely linked with the Rephaim, and who are from the Anakim, who are from the Nephilim. I mean, he's definitely in this giant, you know, clan lineage. But the dimensions of the bed are not just a throwaway. They're not just there to impress you. Those dimensions are exactly, to the cubit, the dimensions of the sacred marriage bed of Marduk at Babylon.
Wow.
Now, you ask, okay, it's fair to say not every Israelite would know that, but literate Israelites would read that and go, okay, I know where that's coming from, you know? But why would the writer do that? Well, the writer wants to link Og back to the Babel event, back to the flood era, and of course to the Nephilim. Why? Because they're bad guys. He wants, you know, the theological point, again, this ties in with the whole harem thing, the logic of the annihilation commands, that they're not indiscriminate, they're not random, they're specifically, those commands are uttered and those verbs of destruction are used specifically where Anakim were spotted in the land. And so they need to be eliminated because they are truly a threat to our existence. They can exterminate us. And since they're, again, part of this hostile rivalry of the gods that goes back to, guess where? Babylon, the Tower of Babel event, Deuteronomy 32:8, the sons of God over the nations, all this stuff, the Old Testament explanation for why nations have other gods. Again, these are not isolated points. They're all, they can be found in a matrix of ideas that are related. So making sure the readers know that, look, we didn't just pick on Og because we didn't like him. or because, hey, he's tall, let's get rid of him. Okay, no, they're picking on Og because he goes back to this. And that's why he's a threat, and that's why we need to take him out. Because if we don't, it's really either us or them. Ultimately, that's what it's going to be.
Wow. It's the kind of context that somebody living in that day and age would have understood. Like today,
Yeah.
I heard somebody describe a very popular show on cable, I won't name, as being what the Lord of the Rings would look like if it were produced by Hugh Hefner. And so, today in our 21st century context, you know that name, you know what he's about, and therefore you know how he would influence the worldview of this particular program. Same approach here. Okay, we know what Og was about with that sacred marriage bed type thing. That's Marduk, that's Babylon. Okay, we understand why now he was a bad guy.
Well,
would that have been like common knowledge back then?
They would have known. There would have been catchphrases. There would have been, again, religious ideas that people were familiar with, like with the sacred marriage, festivals in pagan cultures, and even, there's a big debate over whether in apostate Israel, whether some of that was imported into Israel as well later on. That was associated with the New Year event, which was, it only happens once a year and it's a holiday, and you kind of, it becomes part of the baggage that as you grow up in the land, well, this is what we do for New Year's Day, So people would have been familiar with, again, some of the language, some of the concepts, some of the rituals, even if they didn't ever observe them. Well, this is what we do for this, celebrate this event. Your thing about Lord of the Rings made me think of the recent retelling of the Passion. Okay, the whole gospel story, again, set in, contemporary culture, 21st century culture. Well, there are ideas that if we're Christians and we know the story well enough, we can be not part of that culture and still kind of know what they're doing. But what the characters are doing and communicating as far as relationships, who the white hats are, who the black hats are, who the ones that can't be trusted, who the betrayer is, all these, again, things that propel the story, you can change all of how that's communicated, but it still gets communicated. And so it's the same situation back here.
It's fascinating. It helps you understand the Bible in a whole new way. The book is The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible, the author, Dr. Michael Heiser. Josh Peck, the host of Into the Multiverse, one of the web-exclusive programs available from SkyWatch TV. You'll find it online at skywatchtv.com. Please look us up on Facebook. Give us a like there. Follow that to our links to our other social media sites, Google+, Twitter, and so forth. And we thank you for watching as we keep watch. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is SkyWatch TV.